There are sounds that the human mind protects itself from forgetting. The sound of a mother's voice, the sound of rain on a tin roof. And then there are sounds that stain the soul, sounds that crawl inside your ear canal and rot there, festering for decades. Harlem, March 15th, 1943, 2:47 in the morning. The city is asleep, wrapped in a blanket of fog and coal smoke. Inside the penthouse apartment at the Graham Court, the silence is absolute. It is the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that usually precedes a bomb blast. Then, the phone rings. It doesn't trill, it screams, a sharp mechanical shriek that tears through the darkness like a razor blade through silk. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is awake before the second ring. He doesn't fumble, he doesn't groan. He sits up, his movement precise, predatory. His hand hovers over the receiver for a split second, a hesitation born of instinct, not fear. He knows that no good news ever travels at 3 in the morning. He lifts the receiver. He presses the cold Bakelite plastic against his ear. He doesn't speak. He listens. On the other end of the line, there is breathing, heavy, wet, the sound of men who have been working hard, and underneath that, a low, static hum, the sound of a connection stretching all the way from a warehouse in Brooklyn, across the river, into the heart of Harlem. Then, a voice. It drips with a slow, southern molasses drawl. It is a voice that reeks of chewing tobacco and entitlement. The voice didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for territory. It simply asked Bumpy if he was listening. Bumpy hears a muffled struggle, the sound of boots scraping against concrete, the sound of duct tape being ripped from skin. And then, the voice of Marcus Washington. Marcus, his lieutenant, his right hand, the man who stood back to back with him in the trenches of the Numbers War. But Marcus isn't fighting now, he is pleading. The southern voice speaks again. He tells Bumpy that this is what happens when people forget their place. He tells him to listen closely. Through the crackle of the phone line, Bumpy hears the splash of liquid. Heavy. Viscous. It hits the floor with a wet slap. The fumes of high-octane gasoline seem to travel through the wire, filling the bedroom in Harlem with the phantom stench of impending death. Then, the scratch of a match. The sound that follows isn't a scream, not at first. It is a whoosh, the sudden violent intake of oxygen as the air itself catches fire. Then comes the scream. It is a sound that defies description. It is the sound of a human vocal cord being pushed beyond the limits of biology. It is raw, animalistic, and terrified. It travels through miles of copper wire, under the rivers, through the switchboards, and drives itself like a railroad spike into Bumpy Johnson's brain. For 4 minutes and 8 seconds, Bumpy Johnson sits in the dark. He listens to the skin of his best friend crackling like parchment. He listens to the fat, rendering. He listens to the laughter of 6 men in the background. A cruel, wheezing laughter that sounds like demons celebrating a harvest. He cannot hang up. To hang up would be to abandon Marcus in the dark, so he bears witness. He sits there, a statue carved from grief and rage, absorbing every decibel of agony. And then, silence. The screaming stops, the laughter fades, the line goes dead with a final indifferent click. The dial tone hums in the empty room. Bumpy places the receiver back on the cradle. He stands up. He walks to the window and looks out over the sleeping city of Harlem. Most men would break. Most men would call the police. But Bumpy Johnson isn't most men. And the police aren't coming for the KKK. In that moment, standing in the moonlight, the grief evaporates. It is replaced by something colder. Something mathematical. 6 men laughed on that phone call. 6 men struck a match. And Bumpy Johnson decides right then and there that 6 men are going to vanish from the face of the earth. That phone call, the sound of fire traveling through a wire, ignited the most brutal, calculated, and silent manhunt in New York City history. Like this video if you believe that some debts can only be paid in blood. To understand the darkness that descended on that phone call, you first have to understand the light that it tried to extinguish. You have to walk the pavement of Harlem when it was the center of the universe. This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a sovereign nation. It was a place where the air smelled of roasted peanuts, damp wool, and the electric ozone of the sportin' life. It was a world of sharp angles and sharper suits, where the rhythm of the street was dictated by the bebop spilling out of Minton's Playhouse and the Savoy. And sitting on the throne of this concrete kingdom was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him Bumpy because of the knot on the back of his head, but the name was a deception. It sounded soft, harmless. The reality was a paradox. Here was a man who could quote Shakespeare and Nietzsche from memory, a man who played chess with the strategic depth of a grandmaster. He was a poet who wrote verses in the margins of his ledger books, but he was also a man who carried a jagged, rusty knife in his pocket because he believed a clean cut was too good for a traitor. He was the CEO of the streets. He didn't just run crime, he administered it. He brought order to the chaos of the numbers racket, turning a hustler's game into a Wall Street operation. When Bumpy Johnson walked from his apartment to his office at the Flash Inn, the street changed around him. It was a physical phenomenon. You could see the micro-adjustments in the crowd. Shoulders straightened, voices dropped an octave. The hustlers on the corner would pocket their dice. It wasn't just fear. Fear is cheap. Any thug with a gun can buy fear. This was respect. Because Bumpy understood something that the politicians downtown never did. To rule a kingdom, you must feed the people. Legend tells of a rainy Tuesday in November. A widow on 116th Street was being evicted. Her life's possessions were soaking up the freezing rain on the sidewalk. The landlord stood there, checking his watch, indifferent to the woman's tears. Then, a black Lincoln Zephyr pulled to the curb. The engine cut. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Bumpy got out. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with that slow, rolling gait, the walk of a man who owns the gravity beneath his feet. He approached the landlord. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't raise a fist. Bumpy simply reached into his breast pocket and produced a roll of cash thick enough to choke a horse. He peeled off 6 months of rent and pressed it into the landlord's shirt pocket. He whispered something to the landlord, 7 words that no one else heard, but that turned the man's face the color of ash. The furniture went back inside. The landlord, he vanished. This was the currency Bumpy Johnson traded in. He was the monster who kept the other monsters at bay. He was the buffer between the people of Harlem and a world that wanted to crush them. But in 1943, the threat wasn't coming from a greedy landlord. It was coming from an ancient hatred, a hatred that wore white hoods and spoke with a southern drawl. They looked at Harlem and didn't see a community. They saw a target. And they decided to strike at the one thing Bumpy Johnson couldn't protect with money or violence: his heart. To understand the rage that fueled the fire, you have to understand the love that was burned away. You have to meet Marcus Washington. Marcus wasn't just a soldier in Bumpy's army. He was the anchor. If Bumpy was the brain of Harlem, Marcus was its beating heart. They had come up together from the mud of Charleston, survived the razor fights in the back alleys, and risen to the penthouses of Sugar Hill. Marcus was the only man in New York City who could look Bumpy Johnson in the eye and tell him he was wrong. He was the conscience that kept the king from becoming a tyrant. He had a laugh that could disarm a loaded room, a deep, booming baritone that made you forget for a second that he was carrying a .45 under his jacket. Picture them on a quiet Tuesday, long before the nightmare. The world outside is cold, but in here, it is warm. They aren't talking about numbers. They aren't talking about the police. They're talking about their daughters. They are talking about the old days, about the taste of the dust in the South, about the improbable miracle of their own survival. Bumpy, usually a statue of stoicism, is smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile. He watches Marcus tell a story, his eyes crinkling at the corners. In this moment, they aren't gangsters. They are just two boys who outran the wolves. Marcus reaches across the table and clasps Bumpy's shoulder. It is a gesture of absolute, unshakable brotherhood, a promise that said, "As long as I am standing, you will never fall." But promises are fragile things in a world made of iron and lead. The tragedy of Marcus Washington wasn't that he was violent. It was that he was fearless. He walked through the world with his head high, refusing to shrink, refusing to look down when a white man walked past. In Harlem, that was pride. But to the men watching from the shadows, the men with the badges and the hoods, it was a capital offense. They didn't hate Marcus because he was a criminal. They hated him because he was a black man who didn't know his place, and they decided to teach him a lesson that would echo through every street in Harlem. The enemy wasn't the Mafia. The Mafia understood business. The Mafia understood rules. This was something older, something primal. The Ku Klux Klan didn't officially exist in New York City in 1943. The history books will tell you they were a Southern ghost story. But the streets knew better. The Klan was alive and well, hiding behind the badges of corrupt beat cops, in the back rooms of dock worker unions, and in the quiet, dusty warehouses of Brooklyn. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Shield, a splinter cell led by a man named Thomas Whitmore. Whitmore was a transplant from Alabama, a former sheriff who had traded his badge for a shipping foreman's clipboard. But he hadn't left his hatred in the South. He had packed it in his suitcase. He saw Harlem not as a cultural renaissance, but as a disease that needed to be cauterized. He watched Bumpy Johnson's rise with a seething religious fury. He couldn't get to Bumpy. The king was too well guarded, too insulated. So Whitmore did what cowards have done since the dawn of time. He looked for the soft target. He looked for the heart. They tracked Marcus for 3 weeks. They learned his schedule. They learned his route home. They learned that every Sunday night he visited his mother on 135th Street and walked back alone, refusing a bodyguard because he felt safe in his own kingdom. The recruitment of the hit team wasn't done with money. It was done with ideology. Whitmore gathered 5 men in the basement of a slaughterhouse in Red Hook. He didn't promise them riches. He promised them a restoration of order. He fed them the poison that says one man's dignity is another man's threat. The decision was made on a Friday. The execution was set for Sunday. They didn't just want to kill Marcus. A bullet is too quick for hate. They wanted to make a statement. They wanted to turn a man into a message. They loaded the van with rope, with rags, and with 10 gallons of premium gasoline. Whitmore looked at his men and told them that tonight they were doing God's work. He told them that by morning, the uppity king of Harlem would be broken. He was wrong. He didn't break the king, he woke him up. Animals know when an earthquake is coming. The birds stop singing. The stray dogs hide under the porches. The air pressure drops and the world holds its breath. Bumpy Johnson was an apex predator, and he had that same primal instinct. In the 48 hours leading up to the phone call, the atmosphere in Harlem shifted. It wasn't something you could see on a police blotter. It was a texture in the air. The streets felt tighter. The laughter in the barber shops felt forced. The whispers stopped abruptly when Bumpy entered a room. He knew the wind had changed. He just didn't know which direction the storm was coming from. He began to test the perimeter. He doubled the runners on the avenues. He checked the drops personally. He looked into the eyes of every man who lit his cigar, searching for a tremor, a hesitation, a hint of conspiracy. But he was looking for betrayal from inside Harlem. He was looking for a rival gangster or a greedy lieutenant. He never looked south. He never looked at the ghosts. The last time they spoke was Sunday evening. Marcus had just finished dinner at Bumpy's table. He was heading to his mother's apartment on 135th Street. It was a walk he had made 1,000 times, 6 blocks of territory that they owned, inch by inch. Bumpy offered him a ride. He offered him a driver. Bumpy felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep Marcus close, a premonition that clawed at his gut. He told Marcus that the night felt heavy, that the wolves were restless. But Marcus just laughed. He adjusted his hat and told Bumpy that a king doesn't hide in his own castle. He said he was safe. He said the streets loved him. He turned and walked into the fog. Bumpy watched him go until his silhouette dissolved into the mist. He didn't know he was watching a dead man walking. Betrayal doesn't always come from a handshake. Sometimes it comes from the blind spot, from the enemy you didn't think was bold enough to touch you. What time is it where you are watching this? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a bad feeling that turned out to be right. The trap wasn't complex. It didn't need to be. It relied on the one thing Marcus Washington had in abundance: confidence. It was 11:15 p.m. Marcus was whistling. The sound echoed off the brick tenements. He was 2 blocks from his mother's house. He passed a parked delivery truck, a white Ford with mud obscuring the license plate. The engine was idling, a low mechanical growl that blended into the city noise. Marcus didn't break stride. Why would he? In Harlem, trucks made deliveries at all hours. He didn't see the side door slide open a fraction of an inch. He didn't see the 6 pairs of eyes watching him from the darkness of the cargo hold. The attack was silent and surgical. As Marcus passed the rear fender, the door flew open. There were no words, no warnings, just a sudden eruption of violence. 6 men swarmed him like ants on sugar. Before Marcus could reach for the .45 under his jacket, he was pinned. A heavy wool sack was thrown over his head, smelling of grease and chloroform. He fought. Marcus was a bull of a man, and he managed to land one solid kick that dented the side panel of the truck. But physics is a cruel master. 6 against 1 is simple math. They dragged him into the darkness of the van. The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. In 3 seconds, the street was empty again. The whistling had stopped. The truck turned the corner and headed toward the bridge, toward Brooklyn, toward the warehouse. The only evidence that a man had existed, that a life had been interrupted, was a gray fedora lying upside down in a puddle of rainwater. Back at the Graham court, Bumpy waited. He waited for the call that Marcus had made it home safe. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. passed. The silence in the apartment grew from heavy to suffocating. Bumpy called Marcus's mother. She hadn't seen him. He called the pool halls. He called the brothels. No one had seen the ghost. By 2:30 a.m., Bumpy Johnson was sitting by the phone, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. He knew. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew the balance of the world had tipped. He sat there, staring at the black plastic receiver, waiting for it to scream. And at 2:47 a.m., it did. The sun rose at 6:14 a.m., but it didn't bring warmth. It only brought illumination to the atrocity. They found Marcus Washington's body in a vacant lot, right in the center of Harlem, where the morning crowd heading to the subway would have to step around him. It wasn't an attempt to hide a crime. It was a billboard. A circle of silence had formed around the body. 200 people, maids, dock workers, school children, standing perfectly still. No one screamed. The horror was too deep for noise. Then came the second tragedy, the mechanical failure of justice. Detective Michael Brennan arrived at 7 a.m. He was a man who knew the streets, a man who took envelopes from the numbers runners on Fridays. He looked at the charred remains of Marcus Washington. He saw the wire still wrapped around the wrists. He smelled the gasoline. He walked over to Bumpy Johnson, who was standing by the edge of the police tape, wearing a coat that cost more than the detective's car. Brennan didn't offer condolences. He lit a cigarette and said, "Looks like a gang dispute, Bumpy. Probably played with matches. Nothing we can do. No witnesses." "No witnesses," Bumpy repeated softly. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the rooftops. He looked at the city that Marcus had loved. And in that moment, Bumpy Johnson realized that the law wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed. It was designed to protect the men in the white hoods and ignore the men in the charred lots. Bumpy nodded slowly. "You're right, Detective," he said. "This is a local matter. I'll handle the paperwork." He turned his back on the police. He turned his back on the law, and the hunt began. Revenge, when done by an amateur, is loud. It is messy. It brings heat. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't an amateur. He was a mathematician of violence. He didn't send an army to Brooklyn to burn down the city. That's what they expected. They expected a race riot. They expected chaos that would give the National Guard an excuse to roll tanks down Lenox Avenue. Instead, Bumpy bought silence. He spent $10,000 in 2 days. He bought the eyes of the dock workers in Red Hook. He bought the ears of the telephone operators. He bought the loyalty of the janitor who cleaned Thomas Whitmore's warehouse. By Wednesday, he had the names: Thomas Whitmore, Bobby Lee Crawford, Vernon Tucker, James Patterson, Earl Dixon, Raymond Hollis, 6 men, 6 addresses, 6 lives that were currently celebrating their victory, drinking in the bars of Brooklyn, thinking they were untouchable because they had badges in their pockets and hoods in their closets. Bumpy sat in the back room of the Flash Inn. He looked at the 6 photographs. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the glass against the wall. He picked up a fountain pen and wrote a number on the back of each photo, 1 through 6. He handed the stack to his enforcers. His instructions were specific. "I don't want them shot," Bumpy said. His voice was level, devoid of emotion. "A bullet is a mercy. A bullet is over in a second. Marcus didn't get a second. Marcus got 4 minutes. He told them he didn't want the bodies found. He didn't want a spectacle. He wanted them to vanish. He wanted the KKK to wake up one morning and realize that their soldiers weren't dead. They were just gone, erased from existence. He wanted to plant a seed of terror that was far deeper than death, the terror of the unknown. The disappearances started 18 hours later. They didn't happen with explosions. They didn't happen with Tommy guns spraying storefronts. They happened in the spaces between heartbeats. Raymond Hollis, the driver of the white truck, was the first variable to be removed from the equation. He clocked out of the meatpacking plant in Brooklyn at 5 p.m. He walked to his car. He lit a cigarette. His wife found the car 3 hours later. The engine was still idling. The radio was playing a baseball game. His lunch pail was on the passenger seat. But Raymond Hollis was gone. There was no struggle, no blood. It was as if the sky had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. Day 2. 2 more men, Crawford and Tucker, vanished from a bar in Queens. They went into the alley to settle a bet. They never came back inside. The bartender waited an hour, then went to check. All he found were 2 half-finished beers on the table and a silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. By day 4, panic had set in. Thomas Whitmore wasn't stupid. He saw the pattern. He knew the math. 4 of his men were gone. No bodies, no ransom notes, no police reports. He holed up in his office on the waterfront. He surrounded himself with 10 armed guards. He told them to shoot anything that moved. He waited for Bumpy Johnson to kick down the door. He waited for the war. But Bumpy Johnson didn't bring a war. He brought a ghost story. On the 6th night, the power to the warehouse was cut. The darkness was absolute. Whitmore screamed for his guards, but the only answer was the echo of his own voice. Whitmore scrambled for the phone, the same phone he had used to broadcast a murder. He lifted the receiver, desperate to call for backup, desperate to hear a friendly voice. But there was no dial tone. Instead, there was a sound, a familiar sound. The scratch of a match. History does not record what happened in that room, There were no witnesses. There was no trial. The next morning, the police found the warehouse empty. Thomas Whitmore was never seen again. He was never declared dead. He was simply declared missing. But on the desk, right next to the phone, was a single object, a gray fedora, the same hat Marcus Washington had worn the night he vanished. It was pristine, unburnt. A message from the King of Harlem that said, "I can touch you, I can take you, and I can erase you." The 6 men were never found. Rumors swirled for decades that they were buried in the foundation of a skyscraper, that they were fed to the incinerators of the city dump, that they were taken out to sea. But the truth was irrelevant. The absence was the weapon. The Ku Klux Klan never came back to Harlem. They learned a lesson that the police could never teach them. You can intimidate a community. You can bribe a judge, but you cannot fight a shadow. But victory has a cost. That phone call changed Bumpy Johnson. The part of him that was a poet, the part of him that laughed with Marcus over a bottle of scotch, that part died on the wire along with his friend. He became colder, more isolated. He realized that to be a king, you cannot have friends. You can only have subjects and targets. He had balanced the equation, but he ended up standing alone on the other side of the equal sign. Luck isn't enough. Violence isn't enough. In the end, the only thing that separates the living from the dead is who is holding the match. 6 men vanished in 6 days, and the NYPD didn't ask a single question. That silence was Bumpy Johnson's true power. Where are you watching from tonight? And do you believe justice was served, or did Bumpy become the very monster he was fighting? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories from the Harlem underworld that the history books are afraid to print, subscribe now. This is Untold Mafia Stories.